Welcome to this, let's call it a lockdown or a COVID-19 episode, because we've done a few in the past. But welcome back to Black No Sugar. My name is still Elizabeth. And today we'll be talking about sexuality education in Uganda and in whose interest most of the policy development around this subject it is, but also why it is important that this is done appropriately. And we do have two speakers today that I will let introduce themselves later, but just to quickly take you through some of the things we'll be covering today is an appreciation of where the policy or where the conversations on sexuality education have come from in Uganda. We know that tradition are taught about sexuality or sexuality education by women. So we know that there's a big percentage that never gets, in quote unquote, the opportunity to get some of this information until when they get to school. Now, 2016, we know that school-based sexuality education in Uganda was mostly fragmented and it was taught under no clear curricula. So you'd find certain schools that don't find certain subjects appropriate for children. I'll let Jackie and Rose the conversation. Jackie?
Okay, so hi everyone, my name is Kemigisa Jacqueline. I am many things, but I think in this particular conversation, I am a feminist journalist and researcher.
Thank you so much. My name is Rose Wachkona. I am a senior program officer with the Center for Health, Human Rights and Development, where we primarily work on sexual reproductive health and rights. Equally, I'm a feminist and so many other things. But we can discuss that later. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jackie, and thank you, Rose, for agreeing to be with us today. So to kickstart this conversation, I will get straight to you, Jackie, on as a child or really as a teenager growing up, do you remember what and from whom you learned about sex, or just other aspects of sexual reproductive health? And can you explain in hindsight what you wish you knew then and how you feel you should have been taught better? Do you even feel like you should have been given that information at that particular age that you got it?
Thanks, Beth. That's an essay question. But I think that maybe contrary to many childhoods, I might have had a different childhood because being raised by a feminist mother. So conversations around sex and reproductive health specifically were had earlier on in terms of just the active response when it comes to questions and being taken seriously as a child. But to contextualize it when it comes to the secondary school education and primary school education, I went to a Catholic school and then a Protestant school. So the Catholic school, I think that's where I encountered my first framing of sexuality, which was in a way proposed as an anti-LGBTIQ plus sexuality framework, because we had senior women teachers who didn't necessarily tell us about quote unquote reproductive health, but rather emphasized on the need to stay away from certain girls who exhibited quote unquote certain characteristics. And I thought that that was pretty shocking for primary school. And I know I got that the same narrative from secondary school, but for primary school, I think for me that was the first time I encountered the word lesbian after the senior woman teacher, and I think we were in probably primary 5, came to tell us about why we shouldn't be lesbians and how we can curb certain traits. So I think that from earlier on, the framing of sexuality in terms of sexuality, not necessarily sexual education, but just the constant attack on quote unquote what society demanded or what society othered. I think that that kind of education for me in terms of if we are framing sexuality education was earlier on. And I think that it's very, I don't know if weird or it counters the kind of the agenda that the alt-right has, because if you're introducing me to homosexuality by telling me why I shouldn't be a homosexual, it's giving me information about homosexuality and allowing me to explore the other sides that I would never ideally had. So I thought that was a very interesting strategy. That I then went home to ask my mother who a lesbian was, and then she had to tell me what that meant, and and then I got the information. So I think that kind of framing around sexual education was interesting for me. But also, aside from that, I think we had a phase in high school where we're being taught about abstinence. And I think that was also within the frame of HIV and within the frame of the Judeo-Christian kind of education that we had, which was mainly around not offering you the different family planning, quote unquote, or the ways in which to understand reproductive health or to understand desires or to understand your body, but rather like a beating of this is the agenda that you should be following, and the agenda in this particular case is abstinence. And of course, it was again framed within the marriage narrative and the purity narrative that is very patriarchal, and the demands of what a woman should, quote unquote, should be and should aspire to. And in turn, we were promised the gains of what it means to abstain and how that can be a straight ticket to marriage and, quote unquote, a proper woman in society. So I hope that I've answered your question within that context.
Yeah, I think your childhood was different, Jackie, because you're raised by a conscious mother who thought it important to actually tell you honest information about sex and everything related to that. I'll just allow me just ask as a follow-up question to you, Jackie, on what you think about, and I think it was written by Sylvia Tamale, children as autonomous sexual beings, that children's sexual rights are usually perceived as a taboo and indicate a moral crisis. I'm asking this because your mother was very open with you about sex and who a lesbian is, and you spoke about things that used to happen in a lot of schools. I know that the schools I went to, for example, were constantly checked for pregnancy, and and that was it really. Like, you would come and they grope you, and then they don't tell you a lot of things except for what you hear in quote unquote mainstream class, like science class or biology and whatever. What are your thoughts about the fact that a lot of African countries, not even just Uganda, still perceive children's sexual rights as taboos and moral crises? What informs that? What informed that kind of narrative?
I think that for the longest time, children's body autonomy is, first of all, I think that it stems from the fact that many people do not treat children as human beings. They treat them as these objects that they can have and nurture, and somehow like there's no independency around viewing a child as, someone who you should, treat with respect. So it's usually the idea of dismissal, or if not dismissal, it is packaged in the maternal overprotection, where certain information is deliberately withdrawn from the child because, quote unquote, the kids should be protected. And I think that the same goes for that trope that I think that many homophobes, as well as alt-right, and I think also very Christian Victorian values, where the ways in which they like to frame or to implement their values is through children. Like, we have those sayings of get them while they're still young, or the narratives around why you need to protect, quote unquote, children from sexual education. And the literature that we read had some interesting citations. And I think one organization called family planning what stood out for me when I just went to their site to just simply see how they frame their fight for the need to change the language around sexuality framework and then change it to national sex education framework. And it also shows the ways in which these values that are largely colonial in terms of the African context, where they think that the child is the vehicle through which morality needs to, to be seen, to be grown, to be groomed. So there's that narrative where it's not necessarily about children, but always, if not often, children are used as the scapegoat to push an agenda that certain institutions or certain people have, in the sense of if you target the children, then you appeal to the morality of the society, which means that, and that's why people throw around phrases like, oh, it could be your child, or what happened if it could be your child, because they're appealing to that paternity or even maternity instinct that majority of human beings have. So then your response to that is usually to defend the child. So I think that those kinds of framing specifically around children, and I think that largely it also stems from the fact that people don't really respect children, and you see that through you see how that is performed in the ways in which people often dismiss children. So I think that many people who have had like different childhoods from mine would attest to like parents not taking their questions seriously, or even just not engaging them, or just simply dismissing. So, or and also speaks to these the normalized things that society has, like, oh, wait until you grow up, then we'll tell you about that. Or the favorite one, which I know from like different Bantu languages, where they'll say, oh, you'll grow up and you will see, but not necessarily taking children seriously for their autonomous beings that they are, and not being treated rather as property of the family or an extension of the mother specifically.
Thank you, Jackie. I like that you point, I think it was the beginning question, that you point to homophobia as also being one of the reasons that we see the language that is used around kids, around children, being a bit unclear. I think there's a general understanding that when a parent starts to tell their children about sex, or general information about HIV, about who shouldn't touch you anywhere, there's a general feeling that you're starting to encourage the child to have sex. And you know, it's very weird because we know that children as young as 10 are involved in sexual activity. And because of that narrative, we've seen that even our Penal Code Act, even after it had been amended, does not speak to sex between two children, right? Yet we know these are some of the cases that police interfaces with. So there is a problem there, right? To you, Rose. Yeah, so I was just really asking how you think culture and religion influence how are equipped with information on sex and then sexual reproductive health information generally.
Thank you so much for that. I just wanted to note that I'm also a lawyer. One of my many faces. Just to correct you a bit there, our penal code does take cognizance of child-to-child sex. So we have it as an offense under our Penal Code Act. The challenge is that our judicial officers actually don't know how to deal with it, because they'll present you with children and they are both charged with having sex, and most of the time those offenses don't amount to a conviction. Usually they'll give them a stern warning and send them back home, depending on their age. So we do have that offense under our Penal Code Act. How our religion and our culture is equipped to handle sexuality education, I think we have a challenge. Almost 70% of our schools and a large number of our health facilities are owned by religious institutions, which is very problematic because the reliance is upon them to disseminate sexuality education. But this cannot be done if they are not in agreement with the curriculum that they are being given to disseminate. And that is one of the biggest challenges we had when we were trying to roll out the National Sexuality Education Framework in that the people who you expect to teach, the people who you expect to extend the services to adolescents and young people cannot do it because fundamentally their religious beliefs cannot allow them to extend information on contraceptives, cannot allow them to extend information on abortion, cannot allow them to extend information that is not having an abstinence basis. So that has been a very, very big problem for us. So you'll find that our government will come up with a curriculum, as they did in the National Sexuality Education Framework, but the schools will just refuse to disseminate this curriculum because it's not within their philosophies, it's not within their way of thinking. So when we cede the powers of the state towards religion, or we cede it towards culture, you go to areas where they disseminate sexuality education like the Chisakati. It is largely based on culture and what culture is. So they'll teach pooling, they'll teach abstinence, they'll teach things which are the preserve of predominantly the Uganda culture. Other cultures don't have the Chisakati. For example, as the Bagis, we don't have such a fora, so it cannot be disseminated in that particular way. So I think our biggest challenge with sexuality education is that we have ceded too much power that is supposed to be with the state to religious institutions and cultural institutions. And we have said that it is their responsibility to disseminate sexuality education. And when we do that, then that means that sexuality education is going to be as against their philosophies, as against their beliefs, and not as against evidence, as we shall see. I'll give you an example of our religious-based hospitals. They don't provide safe abortion care, neither do they provide post-abortion care because it's not within their philosophies. Again, they will not disseminate sexuality education because it's not within their philosophies. And because they own these schools, everyone who goes to study there will not be able to partake of such information or such services. So when the state cedes this responsibility and gives it up to religious institutions or to health or to cultural institutions, it means that we are not going to have sexuality education which is based on evidence, but one which is based on religious philosophies, religious beliefs, or cultural beliefs.
As you are speaking, you are talking about the fact that the state has mostly ignored, I don't think the state has ignored, but I think religious leaders and norms and traditions from our different backgrounds have mostly led the conversation on sexuality education, right? Why does the state not seem to have interest in this kind of thing? Because that even when the framework on sexuality education came up for discussion, there was a lot of clash back about it. Why do you think this was the case?
I think because the social issues are largely ignored within the state, and this is because they are considered women's issues. When you look at the issue of housing, who stays at home? It's the woman, so it's a woman's issue. When you look at issues of education, as Jacqueline said, a child is considered an extension of a woman. So primarily your mother is responsible for your education. That's why we have a minister of education who is female, a minister of health who is female. Everything to do with social issues is usually by and large considered a female issue. And when something is feminized and it's considered a female issue, it takes a back seat in the discourse of the country. So when you're talking about the right to vote and you're talking about the right to move, freedom of movement, everyone will stand up and they'll go up in arms. But talk about sexual reproductive health rights as a right. Everyone will just say, those are women's issues. Women know how to handle their issues privately away from the public sphere. So why don't they deal with their things the way they've been doing it for the past 1,000 years, quietly, where women are not bothered about it? So sexuality education for long has been a preserve of women. You get the information from your grandmother, you get it from your senga, you get it from your sisters, depending on which culture you come from. Even when you go to the school setting, it will be the senior woman. You won't have a koja, you won't have a senior man, like it's not there. So the onus is on the woman to learn sexuality education, and it was largely limited to how to have sex, maybe please your husband, maybe prevent a pregnancy or two. Those conversations were always there. And because sexuality education has been considered a woman's issue and women are considered the owners of knowledge of sexuality education, it has taken back burner. And as I had already said, the state is not interested in women's issues. They are interested in global discourses of wars and protecting the country and our boundaries, but issues that affect us socially are not any of their concern. So they've ceded that power. They haven't ignored, they have given it up to religious institutions, and they've given it up to cultural institutions. And that is why we have a big problem. Even in the drafting of the National Sexuality Education Framework, they left it to religious leaders to actually draft this particular framework. And when you look at that framework, it's all about teaching you about God. They will teach you about abstinence, how to pray. All that is within the framework, which is supposed to be a sexuality education framework. So when you tell religious leaders to draft for you a sexuality education framework, that is what you can expect. But it's because of the lack of prioritization, since sexuality education has been feminized completely.
And maybe, Beth, can I chip in there just to offer a political economy critique within Rose's explanation? And I think it also comes down to what Rose was speaking about, the prioritization. And prioritization is also largely around the funding, state funding. So if you look within the neoliberal framework that the government is operating, or if you look at the decades, so for example, the early 90s to the early 2000s, when neoliberalism was being rolled out by the IMF and World Bank structures, it meant that certain sectors that don't deliver immediate profits were put at the backdrop. So, and then that largely meant that the service and welfare sectors were largely left to either the NGO or left to the religious institutions, and which mostly religious institutions that provide, that filled that specific gap around services, filled it with their own agenda. So you find that, for example, budgets that take precedent when it comes to the government budgeting are military, infrastructure, the things that the neoliberal framework considers as profitable. So the government then leaves this kind of institution, or the kind of sector that it doesn't see as benefiting. So the profits are not immediate. The profits of investing in education are long-term and not immediate. So if you're looking at investment, rarely will people invest in that. But also you have to look at, for example, if you're looking at within the colonial context of Uganda, where the church is the state. And I usually enjoy analysts who will say the church state rather than the state, because the ways in which Uganda, of course, was fragmented together or sword together, whatever language you choose to use, there's always been that contrast between the state, the church, and then the cultural institutions. So that power balance also means that the government within that political kind of power struggle has to give and take. And in what ways can you give and take? Then give and take of sectors that you don't find profitable, that you know that you won't get quote unquote big loans from, because they're not necessarily on the agenda. So even within that the patriarchal framing or feminizing of sectors like health and education, within that it intersects with that neoliberal economic framework as well. So you have all these structures that are layered upon layered that actually intersect, and then we get things like the National Sexuality Framework being designed, or even being left to religious institutions to draft.
And Beth, that's why you will have examples of our First Lady coming up, or the Minister for Education coming up to, and it's a national headline, and we are all proud of it, saying, oh, Uganda has such poor parents. That's why our kids are getting pregnant. But is that the underlying issue? Is it true that all parents are so bad that their education can fail to identify the reasons why there are rampant teenage pregnancies within the country? Then you begin to wonder, is it only just poor parenting?
Yeah, but I guess that's what we get for having a raging evangelical as someone who is in charge of a pedagogical institution. So, yeah.
I remember, Rose, you made reference to the section as making reference in the Penal Code Act, and as talking about 121, and I think as making reference to a case by Justice Gardenia, not really recently, in April, where he made reference to the fact that that section that we usually call the child-to-child sex, I think it's 129A, the amended section, does not actually allude to such, does not mean child-to-child sex, but really that's a very long discussion, because I think in that case, the offender was 17 and the girl was 12. They said the section is clear. The Children's Act says the children should both be below 12. So what happens to children between 13 and 17? Because now the offender is 17, who is essentially still a child, and the victim is 12. Thank you very much, Jackie, for putting this thing in perspective. And I agree with you, Rose, when you say that it's not a priority of this government to care about your children that are getting defiled every single day. And this kind of narrative, I remember someone was saying something about most of these issues, murders that were happening, for example, in 2016, would the response would have been different if there are men that were being killed around? Would someone's father, someone's breadwinner, since it was affecting a lot of men? But thank you very much, Jackie, for putting that in perspective. And maybe we should have begun from even just sharing with those watching what sexuality education is, but also the difference between the terminologies that we kept on using. What is sex education? And maybe I'll just ask Jackie to just get back to me on this. Is sex education the same as sexuality education? Is access to information on sexual reproductive health rights a part of sex education? And why I'm asking this is because maybe this is why there's a lot of flashback towards the proposal or the discussion around the national framework on sexuality education and confusing it for another way of the gays recruiting people's children.
Thank you, Beth. And I think that I will throw the particular in terms of the accuracy around definition of sexuality to Rose, but I will speak to, because of their expertise, but I'll speak to the sense of the ways in which we live sexuality, or the ways in which why that was very contentious. And I went down the rabbit hole of looking at all the different cited papers and references within that paper that Patra had shared with us to read. And one of the contestations from the Family Watch organization, it's an international organization that quote unquote props family values on childcare, and of course is rooted in alt-right Christian ideology. And one of the problems that they had with the framing of sexuality is because when you talk about sexuality, it opens room for the understanding that actually gender is socially constructed. Rather, when you focus on sex, then you go with the scientific definitions, which are around male, female, and that means that takes away from the larger conversations of the different ways sexuality can be expressed outside of one's gender or one's assigned sex at birth. So their worry is that the terminology largely, when you say sexuality, it then opens up for more questions around what is sexuality? Why is that different from sex? And I think that that particular article, which I found really, really fascinating was that they had over 10,000 signatures from people from religious institutions to people from education-wise who were all objecting to such languaging. And I think that your question also really points out to the importance that we rarely give language within a policy framework, and the ways in which certain language that is used for certain things opens up discourse around that particular issue. For example, this is specifically to sexuality. And I think that your question around the language and the framing and the fear around that, and I think an important paper, which is also cited in an important article, is from Slivia Tamale, and I think that was the, let me see, I don't want to murder that because my ancestors will be mad if I murdered it, but the article, Out of the Closet, Unveiling Sexuality Discourse in Uganda. So, and it stems from that case of the Equal Opportunities Commission when they were being asked to have like sexual minorities among the marginalized within their framework, and how that discourse on sexuality also then brought in this particular, which is framed now as the gay agenda, or the need to corrupt the children. So I think that there is a lot of power when it comes to sexuality education, which is largely around preferences, and sexuality is also largely around intercourse outside of sex as biologically described or within that scientific framework. And I think that sexuality often moves away from the ways in which our education has been rigid, in the sense that they're teaching you things where, and I think I'll borrow from paraphrase conceptualization of a banking system of education. So the banking system is where they're teaching you to be dispositories, like they just throw knowledge at you and you swallow. But when they're throwing knowledge at you that is around sexuality, and they're saying, oh, there are these particular parts, or pregnancy, or there's the option of abortion, or like when it comes to the intimacy around your body and understanding your body, then that framing of education doesn't surpass, because then it moves away from the books, it moves away from science, and it becomes a practical thing. And when it becomes a practical thing, if you tell me about abortion, if you tell me about like sexual preferences, if you tell me about sexual practices or pleasure, then that becomes personalized. So when that is personalized, so then the language of sexuality education becomes a threat. Rather, if we go with the language of a national sex framework, then it becomes around sex in the biological sense. And I will throw the ball to Raj to do the quote unquote technical definitions of sexuality as per the national framework. And I know I read it, but I wouldn't do it justice.
Yeah, thank you so much. And indeed, there are formal definitions for some of these things. For comprehensive sexuality education, it is usually taken as a rights-based approach which seeks to equip young people with knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values they need to determine and enjoy their own sexuality. So it's all about arming them with information that is wholesome nature, so that they can be able to make good decisions. The challenge with this is that people are in agreement with sexuality education. The problem is the word comprehensive, because when you talk about comprehensive, you're talking about everything to do with sexuality. So you will have eroticism in there, you will have BDSM, you will have same-sex relationships, and you're telling people all about these nitty-gritties. So people are thinking, oh my God, when you add the word comprehensive to sexuality education, then we won't be telling them that sex is supposed to be had between a man and a woman who are married in the safety of their bedroom under a blanket. So when you enlarge it to the point of comprehensive is where now the controversy begins to occur, because people don't want the controversy of comprehensive, because then you begin to recognize that everyone has different environments, recognize that everyone has different desires, recognize that everyone has different beliefs, and you have to include it in the package of information that you extend towards young people. And that is not what they want. They want to maintain the linear knowledge of sexuality or sex as they know it, so that children are limited to that small bit of sexuality education. So that is where the controversy comes in. But whenever we go to meetings with most people and you talk about sexuality education, there is an agreement. Everyone's like, yes, children need to be told about sex. They need to be told, but they want a certain version of sexuality education and not the comprehensive version of it all. When it comes to sexuality, I think the general definition is how people express or how they feel about how they express their sexuality or their attitudes and beliefs towards sex. So it goes down to the gingerbread man in terms of identity, characteristics, how do you express sexually? And that is it by and large.
I wanted to speak to Rose's point, because I think that you talk about two interesting things around, because earlier you had mentioned about how even when this particular sex education is or the framework is rolled out, largely because of the kind of education and health service sector ownership, that won't be implemented. So I find it very interesting, like the conflict between policy formulation and policy implementation. But yet, even when religious institutions or these both health and education institutions can exercise their power in terms of not implementing, I find it fascinating that they would still object to beautifully written prose of such a framework. So I think that for me, when I was reading when I was reading the literature earlier on, I thought was an interesting conflict, if not to call it that, because there's a clear gap between policy formulation and policy implementation, and who it affects again, but also again who actually formulates it. So I just wanted to ask you, from your experience of doing sexual reproductive health from both a legal perspective and a policy perspective, how are you finding that gap, and why do you think that particular gap exists, or what are your thoughts around that particular conflict and the ways in which it manifests itself, both from those who are framing and those who are producing the national frameworks versus those who are to implement versus those who will it affect?
And Rose, when Rose was sharing, I remembered that sometime I was in a space where we were developing an action plan on some piece of work that I do. And I remember using the word diverse and comprehensive became a problem. But when you say women in their diverse nature, that you're leaving room for inclusion of those other people that are illegal. And for other, really here, they meant lesbian women or bisexual women or transgender women. And then the usage, I remember in a conversation with actually Sehad and I remember was a commissioner who was speaking to the fact that when you say comprehensive sex education, that what's the meaning of the word comprehensive in this sense? And I found that a bit weird. What do you mean? What's the English meaning of the word comprehensive? It's exactly that, something that speaks to a lot of things. But I guess that was a problem. So I will circle back to you, Sarah, to just ask. I know we do not have a lot of time. Are there any existing policy frameworks to guide on sexuality education? And what are some of those gaps that you've noticed?
Thank you so much. We do have the National Sexuality Education Framework that I have been talking about right here, but it hasn't yet been given the implementation run, majorly because the religious leaders have refused to assent to it. And again, as you are talking about, Jacqueline, it's all about that contradiction between the technocrats and the people who we put into politics, because most of our politics is not determined by who is most competent in an area or in a particular field. But our politics is determined by populism, can I say? So if the born again church is putting the most pressure on the president, then he'll give them a minister who is a minister for education or one for health, and they will carry their beliefs into the ministry. So we are not going to have an evidence-based generation of policies. Our policies are going to be siphoned or taken away by religion, by culture, because then these people are brought to the table and they are going to discuss what is going to go into that particular. So even when we have very poor indicators where they will tell you that 1 out of every 4 teenage girls is either pregnant or has a child, where they will tell you that our population, 58% of it is below the age of 21. And out of those, 48% are below the age of 15. Where they will tell you that over 22% of all teenagers will tell you they are having sex at any one point in time. Even with these indicators, they don't ring true for them because they are not in line with the ideals or the perspectives of the philosophies that they hold dear and true. And that is our biggest problem, because we have pushed away science, we have pushed away evidence, and we have decided that everything is to be generated as according to culture and as according to religion. So those are some of our biggest issues. But another thing that Jacqueline was talking about was the issue of implementation. Implementation in such a way that our government has not prioritized the service delivery. You know, when we are talking about sexual reproductive health rights, we have 2 arms. The arm of information, there is the arm of service. The arm of service delivery is not strengthened, then there is a problem. For example, I'll give you an example of an issue of consent that we are working on just recently, where we have a policy for adolescents where they cannot consent to sexual reproductive health and services. And the minister is saying that they cannot access contraceptives. So even if you disseminated the information to them that you can use maybe a condom or you can use contraceptives to control pregnancy, when they go to a health facility, they won't be able to access this particular service. But then at the same time, allowing religious institutions like in health facilities to control what services they can or cannot offer, like post-abortion care. In Zambia, when you go there right now, you can't get post-abortion care because it's a religious-owned institution. In Mengo, same thing. So these are some of the challenges that we continue to face because religion has penetrated in the service delivery system, in that even where services can be offered, they just refuse to offer them. And it's the same thing for information. They will not accept a curriculum which will talk about contraceptives for teenagers. They won't accept a curriculum which will talk about same-sex relationships. They won't accept a curriculum which talks about abortion. They won't accept a curriculum which goes against their long-established form of family. So for them, a family, you have to understand it from that perspective, is a man and a woman within a relationship having sex in the bedroom. Anyone outside of that relationship should not and must not be having sex. Therefore, they are not entitled to information or services. And this has affected our sexuality education framework. It has affected the implementation. So everything is just askew. That's why we see that there are rising numbers of teenage pregnancies and so many things going wrong. So the only policy we have is that one, but it's currently not being implemented even.
There's someone in the comments, Tabitha, who says, Jackie makes great points. One blindsiding to note on petitions generated by these white evangelical groups is that their signatures, that those signatures are not originating from the locals. These signatures on petitions come from the global north, where organizations such as Family Watch International are housed. I think this was in response to a point you were making about some of these NGOs and the work they do. One last question that I'd like for us to speak to Jackie is, since this is a conversation
Maybe
about
Beth,
sexuality. Yes, please.
Just to comment about that question, rather that comment that Tabitha makes within the chat, there is the thing that these white evangelicals are speaking a language that most people understand, because I've been in some of their forums. Those are our secrets, but they speak a language which people understand. So it resonates in terms of their religion, and it also resonates in terms of their cultures. You have to note that over 98% of Ugandans subscribe to one form or the other of religion. 78% of them say they are Christian. The other say they are Muslim. So when these people are making all these petitions, they'll find general consensus or general knowledge, and people will agree because they are speaking a language they understand. They are talking about a family that most people recognize as the ideal. So our issue is, how do we push back against such a narrative where you're saying that, yes, this is your ideal family, but not everyone has an ideal family? What about the effects of some of these policies on people who don't fall within the ideal? So it's not about just saying that, oh, whatever they are doing is not about what people want or what they don't want. Actually, most people resonate with it. Recently, when we were pushing back against the Geneva Consensus Declaration, it found a lot of agreement with most people. But when you began to break down, when I talk about the Geneva Consensus Declaration, it was a consensus formed by people who wanted to promote pro-life ideas. And they came together to say that abortion is not a right. So they put it in paper and appended their signatures as countries. And most people were in agreement. They're like, yes, this is a good thing. This is a good thing. But when you begin to break down that declaration for them, saying that government is ceding its obligation to fund healthcare, even post-abortion care, then they begin to question, so can we begin to unpack that languaging that is being used by people like Family Watch International? Because they are speaking to the ideals that people in our society hold dear and firm. And I'm sure even Jacqueline will agree. That's how you're raised. That is what you know. Mommy, daddy, children, and anything that falls under that clean image is just pushed out of the bag. But how does it affect people and their ability to live dignified lives? Because we have to push the idea of dignity. Even when you don't agree with what people are doing, can you afford them the ability to live a dignified life?
Beth, before you come in, and I know we're running short of time, I just wanted to comment on that. Specifically looking at, and I think that when we frame culture, there is a tendency to look at it as static. And there's a tendency to also look at it as being housed between a nationality or a border, and yet culture doesn't operate like that. And I also think that when we talk about what quote unquote is considered African culture and isn't African culture, specifically looking at the colonial patriarchy that is rooted in Judeo-Christian values and the ways in which they have been passed over. So I think that it's also really impossible to have a conversation around sexual and reproductive health without necessarily having a conversation around the decoloniality that needs to be done within certain frameworks. And I think that Rose mentioned something interesting. I was also reading upon how the UN African bloc was largely pushing against the term sexuality and sexual education as frameworks within within the UN. So I think that when we look at these quote unquote, what is our culture and the ways in which we look at the nuclear aspect of family, it's also very interesting that within that Christian conceptualization is hypocrisy, because we know that largely the people we know, the families we know, they don't practice Christianity as prescribed by the Holy Book. That those values are aspirational in the sense of with heaven as a reward if you practice achieve certain ways, which means that you can aspire to them, but largely are not practical. And I think that the interesting approach to that, which I think is even within religious leaders, I know we've seen scandals around religious leaders, whether they're priests in their celibacy, practicing outside, like the open secrets that everyone knows, that children of the father won't call him father, will rather call him uncle, in the ways in which that language is coded, depending on where you are stationed in life. So I think that the interesting things around sexuality and sexual education, and again, when it comes to framing, or when it comes to the things that religious groups stand for, there's at the heart of that, there's a certain hypocrisy around whose culture is it, what culture is, but also around the practice of even the values that they claim to have, which for me, I think also largely goes down to where the money is coming from, which I think is very, very important when it comes to who is funding what. And in journalism school, they always teach us to follow the money, that's where the story is. So I think that in discussing sexuality education and even discussing languaging, we also need to discuss issues around history within pre-colonial, like the kind of colonial patriarchy versus the pre-colonial patriarchy, around sexuality as understood by separate communities and what it is now and versus what it can be. But also the question around the ways in which technology has thrown that ball rolling, and technology not necessarily to limit it to communicative technologies like social media and all, but also technologies around the analog parts, which are probably like radio and television, and the kinds of information that people are getting versus what we within the legal framework or within the justice system is accessible. So yeah, Beth, over to you. I just wanted to point out some of those things that don't really match with what Christians say and what Muslims say and versus what they do.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, it is well noted that in Uganda we have 53 tribes. Now that is just Uganda alone. Imagine how Africa is. And every tribe has its own perception of sexuality, how to handle familiar relationships. You find in other relationships, so oh, that is incestuous, but other people will say, no, it's not. Other people will do the pulling, others will do the cutting. Everyone has a different way of looking at sexuality. So to expect homogeneity, I don't know how to put that right, it to be homogeneous for 53 tribes, each of which has a different name for a vagina, a different name for a penis. I don't think that is practical. And even as Tabitha says in the chat, really, the results of our ideal are not what we ascribe to. We have single mothers, we have child-headed homes, we have so many things that show us that yes, we have an ideal, but we have fallen so far below what the ideal is supposed to be, in that I think we just need to deconstruct that entire ideal and say, okay, how do we support everyone in their different environments, in their different realities, in order to have something where everyone can be able to be.
Not one discovers, I do not want to be the person that we all know that does not want to live power. I need to close this, but with just one more last question that we'll do in 2 minutes on how this narrative at the end of the day, because you're talking about sexuality education in reference to children, how does this affect children? So I'll give Jackie 2 minutes and Rose 2 minutes to just respond to that so that then we can close.
Can you repeat the question? Are you asking how sexuality education affects children?
No, how either the lack of it right now, especially in the context of Uganda, is affecting children.
I think that for me, I look at it in 3 different ways, because if we're under the impression, we are in a patriarchal state. So the different layers to violence. There's a violence that comes when information is deliberately withdrawn, which means that then even though it's not like the immediate violence that people would necessarily run to or even actively push for, it essentially means that then the other violences, like the the increase in teenage pregnancies, the violence that women face, just the homophobia that comes out of this lack of information. So I think that for me, generally not having such a framework, or let me even not speak the language of frameworks, because I think that when we say language of framework, we limit it to a certain number of people who can read within the English language, but also a certain kind of people who have access to certain institutions. So I think for me, the point around the education would be for me to focus more on the discourse. So when we look at families, or when we look at access to information, or largely when we look at culture and quote societal norms, the deliberate withdrawal of that information means that the children are going to go out to seek whatever information that they can get, but also their bodies will be telling them different things. So I think for me that my biggest point will be around the withdrawal of information and the violence that comes out of it, and how it builds a ladder of bodies, whether it comes to the women being murdered, or the women being othered, or whether it comes to the ways in which it affects budgetary allocations, or the ways in which it affects women's lifestyle in terms of not having access to abortion services, but also having or the ways in which it demands that women's bodies are being legislated upon as objects, but also being termed as private spaces, and how the ways in which that largely treats children as not the autonomous beings that they are, but rather objects of the states, and of course objects of objects of capital specifically. Rose, over to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to what you said in my parting shots, that once I was listening to Hope Chigudu, which most feminists know who she is. She's a renowned African witch, and she was saying that most of us are brought up, and as African women, or even as young people, our sexuality is either repressed or it's exploited. When we do not disseminate comprehensive sexuality education, we leave our young people susceptible to exploitation. That is when they'll give them a sugar cane in exchange for sex, or 200 shillings, or a chapati. We recently had the case of an egg in exchange for sex. But why is that happening? It's because they are being exploited. You can only be exploited because you're not empowered with the information. If you don't have information, you do not know even the consequences of having sex, or what you're going to do under such circumstances. So I think we need to stop leaving our children susceptible to exploitation by empowering them with information. The world has moved so fast. With smartphones, they have access to information, but what sort of information is this that they have access to? So I think we need to do a lot and do better. And we need to move into comprehensive. Why? Because of globalization. Globalization has made the world so much smaller. And when it makes it smaller, people are exposed to all forms of sex, all sorts of different relationships, and all sorts of different ideologies. And comprehensive sexuality education arms them with the ability to manage all this bombardment from all areas.
Well, I wish we could, and I have so many other questions I wish we could go over, but thank you so much, Jackie, for your time. Thank you, Rose, for sharing all this information with us. If you're watching this episode, please do share some feedback with us on what you think Uganda's framework right now looks like, but also on how it's affecting children.